You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to Making Tracks. I'm your host for tonight, Mark Newbold, and we bring you a special episode. Not special for the reasons we usually would bring such a show, but special because of the guy that we're going to talk about tonight. And remember, Jonathan Rinzler, J.W. Rinzler to many, was an author who published an incredible array of books: Star Wars Blueprints, The Making of Star Wars Empire and Jedi, a plethora of other books. But he'll be best remembered as a friend to fandom. He was a guest on many shows, many websites and podcasts over the years. And we had the good fortune to speak to him a number of times since 2006, but most recently, just last year. This interview originally went out as part of an episode of Canon Fodder, but we're going to put it out tonight on the day that we learnt of his passing on the 28th of July from pancreatic cancer. So here's our chat, myself and Mark Mulcaster, for Empire 40 with Jonathan Rinzler. Welcome back to Empire 40. We're here with Jonathan Rinzler. We're going to talk about the making of Empire Strikes Back, all things Empire, and other stuff as well. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, it's nice to talk again. As you were saying, I think we've spoken a few times before.
Yeah, it's been a few years, but it's always good to catch up, and there's always stuff to talk about. So, Empire 40 years since the film came out. You released a book that went down gangbusters about 10 years ago, Making of Empire. When that project started, what were your expectations? Because obviously you'd released Making of Star Wars, which had gone over great, and then you move on to the sequel. Did it feel a little bit like George and Gary Kurtz when you were trying to make the sequel and expand on what the first one did and make it even better? Were there surprises in store for you when you were working on it? What was the sort of the lay of the land when you were working on that book?
Well, there was no guarantee that there would be a Making of Empire, depended on how Making of Star Wars sold. And I think Making of Star Wars surprised everybody, including myself. I just tried to do the best I could do, and then suddenly, I think the first sign was that Ain't It Cool News did a positive review, and then it was on the New York Times bestseller list, and so it kept selling well enough so that Random House decided, okay, we'll do another one. And George obviously liked the first one enough to say, okay, it's okay if you do another one. So that was exciting. Yeah, obviously not like doing a movie, but I did want to make the second one better if possible. But there were a few surprises along the way. Yeah.
What were the differences in terms of, obviously, like any project, any book, anything that you do it the first time. And when you do it the second time, if you're smart, you learn from, not the errors, but, you learn from what you did the first time and you build upon it. What was the building process to make an Empire a more satisfying book, if you want to put it in those terms, a deeper dive than the original Star Wars one? What was it that made it that bit better?
Well, I don't know that it did come out any better. One of the things that happened on the Making of Star Wars was I said I need more pages, and they said you can't have more pages. So we said, all right, well, I'm working with the designer. The designer was in San Francisco, the publisher is in New York. So the designer and Lucasfilm, or basically me and the art director, got together and said, well, let's just make the font size smaller so it'll fit. And then, of course, many people complained that it was hard to read, which it is. But that was our only solution. But then at the 11th hour, when the book was already laid out, well, we're going to make it 30 pages longer or 50 pages longer, actually. I can't remember. And that's why you have that, for the hardcover, you have the storyboard section at the end. We threw that in, and that was okay. It's not like it was pointless. So for the second one, going at the beginning, I knew I had more pages, which made it easier to write. And I also did the book map myself. So I put all the photographs exactly where I wanted to and the size I wanted to, because that had been frustrating on the first one. So a lot of it has to do with just bookmaking. And then there was, some terms of technique. I learned from the first one, sort of how to streamline the process of writing so that it was a little bit easier. And it definitely was easier for Empire. But there were still some mistakes made along the way, not in terms of facts, although there's always a couple of those, unfortunately. But just in terms of the process of making a book, there's so many things that can go wrong.
So generally, How do you, I mean, because it's such a big book and there's so much information and so much research that's gone into it. How do you approach it? Where do you start? Is it going into the archive and seeing what you can find, or do you have like a premise to begin with?
Well, it's a multifaceted approach. And you have to remember that I'm still doing my day job. My day job was working at Lucasfilm and editing a whole bunch of other books about Star Wars. And at that time, also Indiana Jones was coming out. So basically, though, it's a question of doing a bunch of things at once, getting the interviews together and starting to go through the transcripts. I've said before, and I'll say it again, thanks to Don Bees, I was able to listen to the original Alan Arnold tapes, all of them. Don had found them. He was working in the archives, and they were in a trash can. They were going to go into the trash, lost forever. And he just made the proactive choice of taking them out of the trash can and bringing them home and putting them in his closet. I ran into him in the archives. I don't know what I was doing there, but I was doing something. And he said, I heard you're doing an Empire book. I have these original tapes. Would you be interested in them? And I said, probably yes. No, I said, definitely yes. So there's just the old cassette tapes. And I think that we made some promotional video that you can see them. And then we reinstated them into the actual archive, so they have them now. And Lucasfilm was great, paid for them all to be transcribed. So that was one thing. And then I go into the production archives, and that's where they have all the, whatever they kept, people's phone logs, calendars, some cases, the music, and whatever it is. They just threw everything into boxes. You never know what you're going to find in a box. It's like a little mini end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's just these boxes stacked on shelves. And I don't know, there were probably 12 or 15 boxes full of Empire stuff from back in the day that had never been opened before. So you go, and basically you go through all this stuff and you create what I call a chronology draft, where I take apart what everybody says and put it in chronological order. Pre-production, production, post-production, and then within those, there's, first draft, rough draft, second draft. What are they talking about? Listening to one of Alan Arnold's tapes, it was the whole thing, and they actually could just hear Irving Kershner and Harrison Ford talking about it. And pretty sure we put part of that on the enhanced ebook version of Empire Strikes Back. That, of course, happened years later. Random House said we could make those audio and video additions to the book for the electronic version. So anyway, it's just a long, long process. And the going through the images and that stuff comes later once I already kind of have a handle on the word part, the sentences part. And then you start going through all the images, and it's an iterative process. In the end, you're making a book. And I think that's where a lot of books fall apart, is people think that they have all this great information and that's the only thing that counts. And of course it does count, but in the end, you're making a book. All the elements of a book have to be done well. And actually on Empire, we completely fell apart in terms of the design. I mean, not completely fell apart, but we didn't, I did a book map, and that's basically what they published, a book map. There was no design. If you would compare Return of the Jedi and Star Wars with Empire, you'll see that design of the interior of the book is not as good as the first and third book, because they just published my book map. Because of miscommunication between me and the publisher, I kept thinking they were going to get a designer, and then suddenly it was done.
And it's getting published.
Yeah.
It sounds like CSI Empire when you say about taking all that paperwork and trying to lay it all out and make some sort of, like you say, chronology. Was there ever an instance where you got so far down the line when you thought, I've got this, I've got that, I've got this, and then something else came out of a box and you thought, oh, crap, I've got to try and work this and make it all make sense? Because like you say, you're still writing a book. It's still got to have the readable feel about it.
Well, thank God for computers, because it makes all of that so much easier. Because I go through all the boxes beforehand, I don't get into a box thing, but there's the late interview that happens, or you find something somewhere else that just sort of appears. Sometimes something shows up in the legal archives, or George might have a story that is a long story that you've got to put in. But because you haven't really got that far, it's all fairly flexible till about the 11th hour. It's easy to make an image smaller, to make room. It's all very, very flexible. That's the good thing about all three books, is that nothing that I can even remember ended up on the cutting room floor. We were able to get it all in. You could always show 100 more photos, and that's what we did on the enhanced ebooks. Mm-hmm. But the best photos are in the books, though. They really are. In fact, the Empire book starts out signed photo from ILM. Now, that should have been in the first book, but that I didn't discover until the first book was completely done and on sale, is when I went to talk to George about I interviewed him for the Indiana Jones book, which was between these two books. Yeah. And I was in his writing room, and I saw that photo on the wall. I'd asked George, do you have anything like that? Because I'd heard about it, and he didn't remember. But, we can't remember everything. So then I saw it, and I said, can I get that scanned? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. I didn't walk out with it, but he eventually sent it from his home to the office, and I went over to the office, and we photographed it and scanned it. So we just used that in the Meaning of the Empire book. So, yeah, it does happen. And certainly, I didn't meet Roger Christian till long after Star Wars was done, when I was doing the Blueprints book, and his interview should have been part of the first book, but you can't, there's a limit on time and how many people you can talk to and all that stuff. It's just the nature of things.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose really, even though it's a factual book, it's still a creative endeavor. And George himself said that all creative endeavors have to be abandoned because either of time or money. So it comes a point when it's just like, we need a publisher's thing, get out of the door.
Right. George says if you have unlimited time and money, anybody will end up with a half-decent film eventually. The trick is to do it with limited time and limited money and hit your schedule. That's the challenge.
When you were working on the book and George, you had access to George and his memories and recollections, how important was it to him that this was as accurate a recollection of the making of Empire as possible? Because that film had some rough edges. It had some difficult paths to navigate on the way to being put up on the screen. How keen was he to see that put down correctly?
He was very keen. George was not passive in relation to the Star Wars books. When I'd get to basically a pretty good first draft, I'd give it to him. And this is long before we lay it out. And he read it carefully. It's not like he would censor it, but if something was wrong or if there was a word was wrong about a technical process or something, he would correct it. He was extremely hands-on in that sense. And then when he was explaining to me, that he had problems with Gary Kurtz and the finances, and he was saying things, I said, look, given what you're saying, I really should talk to Gary Kurtz, because journalistically, you have to give Gary Kurtz his chance to defend himself, basically. Not that George was attacking him, but he was saying this was not being done or something like that. And George said, fine. And I was able to get a hold of Gary Kurtz and talk to him, which was great. And he basically defended himself, saying it didn't matter that we were going over budget because the movie was going to make its money back. Everybody knew that. I said, here's what Gary said to George. And George is not the emperor. He did not suppress or change. He couldn't change, but he didn't suppress everything that Gary said is in the book. And he's fine with people having their say. He had his say, Gary Kurtz had his say, and that's, then we move on. I'd also show him the book when it was all laid out. He never really had any changes at that stage, but he would see it, and he definitely looked at it. I know for a fact, because there's the other projects where George was just like, yeah, whatever. There's a very distinct difference between George carrying and George saying, I trust you, just do your thing.
Before you did Making of Star Wars, you'd worked on the Making Revenge of the Sith book, where you were on set for that. So how different was it from being involved and seeing it happen to then being your own Indiana Jones and being an archaeologist and going through, archives and obviously having a working relationship with the film because you're a fan and you work for Lucasfilm, but how different was it doing those two books, stacking those side by side?
Well, it's basically doing like you say, an archival, archaeological kind of book where everybody's basically a lot more relaxed because you're talking about things that happened 30 years ago, to being on the set where everybody's really stressed and there's a lot of stuff going on and everybody's kind of walking on eggshells. Not that there was any screaming or stuff, but it's just a lot of money is at stake and there's a lot of moving parts. And you're this guy just kind of standing there with nothing to do except watch what's going on. I can tell you it's a lot easier doing the archival books. Revenge book took 3 years of work pretty much every single day. The archival books were, you get to go home, you can see your family. The days are a lot shorter. It was just morning, nights, and weekends. It's much more relaxing, much more relaxing. I really wish they'd go back and do Revenge of the Sith as a coffee table book. And just lay it out again and also add the online part that's not in the hard physical version and let me write just 4 pages to end it and reissue that one.
Am I right in thinking that actually during the filming of Revenge of the Sith and your time on set, you actually saw bits of Empire Strikes Back being refilmed, the Vader Emperor conversation? Yeah,
I saw that, the whole thing. I didn't know it was going to happen. Rick just came up to me towards the end of one day and said, hey, when we wrap today, you stick around. And I didn't know what was going to happen. And the next thing I knew, Hayden Christensen Christensen was there in the Darth Vader costume, and Ian McDermott was there as the Emperor, and they were just like a tiny little crew doing that one scene that George had rewritten to make it more fit with the prequel trilogy. It was very exciting.
Just to step back briefly, it just strikes me, if that opportunity ever came along to do a larger version of Revenge of the Sith, presumably you would be your own Alan Arnold. You'd be able to go back to your notes that you took at the time and give it more. Is that what you're thinking? If you had the opportunity, you could make it more of a coffee table type book, that there's more to fill in if you wanted to, or you could?
Yeah, I could certainly go back and add stuff. Yeah, I don't know what notes. I mean, they're in boxes somewhere. It would take some time. But even if they just stuck with the text as there, they could enlarge the images. They could, the cover for that book is horrendous. We could have a much better cover, and it could just be a nicer book, and fit with the other ones in terms of just the physical size.
I mean, I personally think the prequels are crying out for the coffee table making of books. I think it would be great to see episode 1 and 2 as well, Yeah,
I mean, they at one point, a couple of years ago, Disney did come to me and say, are you interested in doing 1 and 2 and then expanding 3? And I said, yeah, sure. But I never heard back from them.
Fingers crossed.
So with Empire then, when you were doing that research, going through the books, going through Alan Arnold, because we're all familiar with Once Upon a Galaxy, so there's a familiar ground there, but you're seeing and hearing stuff that we never got to read as readers back in the day. What was the biggest surprise that you came across, be it something that either happened on set or something you learned about the making of the film that you didn't know? What sort of jumped out and made you think, wow, I had no idea?
For Empire, we're talking about.
Yeah, Empire, yeah.
A lot of it. I mean, because I don't go into these projects as knowledgeable as people might think. I've seen the movies. I obviously working at the company, but I hadn't done tremendous amount of research before. Each project I'm learning a lot, and that's what I like about the projects. If I already knew the stuff, or if I had biases, it would be different. So I have no biases, and I have no axe to grind, so a lot of it is discovery. And I think for me, the biggest was realizing how screwed up it became in terms of the finances. It was very serious. George risked losing the company, and it's true that it was going to probably make money. He wasn't risking at all, but it was a pretty unprecedented step to pay for your own big budget movie, and it ended up costing a lot of money, and it went way over budget. And the proof being that if it was such a slam dunk, the Bank of America would not have pulled the loan.
Sure. Yeah,
they pulled the loan because they saw what happened to Godfather 2.
Yeah,
which was didn't make half as much as The Godfather, and they thought, we're getting out of here while the getting is good. And so George had to give up more to the studio, which I think annoyed him a great deal, and then deal with Bank of Boston. And he brought on Howard Kazanjian, who was sort of a more experienced kind of, production guy to deal with the finance side of Empire. And Gary Kurtz was kind of moved over to do more of the stuff that, I guess more sort of directly film related material stuff, but not deal with the finances. And Howard Kazanjian, and some of that's going to be covered in this Howard Kazanjian book that's coming out next spring. But it's pretty much covered in The Making of Empire Strikes Back already. So that was a big revelation to me. And then just how, I think also talking to all the ILM guys, Dennis Murin and Ken Ralston and Lauren Peterson, they all said that, and Ralph McQuarrie too, they said that Empire was the hardest movie they worked on because they were kind of newbies and sort of having fun with Star Wars and learning, and there really wasn't that much at stake. Whereas for Empire, now it was much more ambitious, much more at stake, much more possibility of failure, and George was asking a lot more of them. And they were starting the studio up in a new, just like the first one, they were still starting a studio up, and they were working on other projects. So all that was very interesting to me to find out.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
When you look back to that time period and you think Spielberg had just done 1941, which went crazily over budget, like Jaws did, but it was a massive hit, so there was risks there. And then he does Raiders, and Raiders under budget, under time, makes crazy amounts of money. Empire costs all that money and puts the company at risk, but then that makes crazy money. They were, like you say, they were just teetering on the brink at points, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's the nature of movie. Nature of movie making. I mean, I've heard from many people who work in Hollywood, if you really want to make money, you do not go into the movie making business. It's not a way to make money. It's a extremely marginal, and most movies are colossal failures. It's not really a good way to make money. You go into it because you love making movies, and it's such a fantastic artistic collaboration of all these different wonderful people in a very crazy pressure cooker kind of way. I mean, Robert Watts was very eloquent talking about that, and how do you deal with this? He was sort of the master diplomat. And Raiders was happening sort of, I guess, as Empire was happening. I don't remember exactly how they dovetailed, but Raiders, the challenge was, to bring in the movie under budget, which Spielberg hadn't been able to do the last few times out. No. And Lucas challenged him to do it, and he famously did. But Empire went way over budget.
If the film would have gone to plan, because obviously Lucas had to sort of at some point, almost not cap in hand, that's not the right phrase, but he had to go back to the bank and ask for more money and make negotiations and compromises. And it put a pressure on the film. Kirsch was making, I remember when I interviewed him and he said, we'd get a shot, lock and go. And the crew were panicking because he wasn't taking all the safety shots, and he knew what he'd got and he wanted to move on, which probably worked to its advantage in a way because it kept moving at a clip. Do you think it would have come out as a different film if it had have gone to plan rather than all the pressures that hit it?
No, I don't think so, because they'd already filmed most of it. It was only about 2 or 3 weeks. It was mostly the Yoda scenes that they had to go a lot more quickly for. And certainly those are some of the best scenes in the movie. Yeah. And Yoda was such a huge risk. I mean, it was a puppet, right? It was an advanced, slightly animatronic puppet. And with the guy who was famous for doing Piggy, they weren't just going to, as you know, where they weren't going to necessarily use Frank Oz's voice. He was just doing a temp voice. And so I think they were probably, George didn't want to overemphasize Yoda in the movie. It was like, Yoda worked perfectly the way it was done. You didn't need more Yoda. More money and more Yoda would not have made Empire better or in any way. It was perfect the way it is.
Yeah, it could have been worse. It could have been a chimpanzee. So
right, exactly. It could have been a chimpanzee, or if Frank Oz's voice was too much like Miss Piggy, that could have been a huge problem.
Yeah.
There's so many ways those things can go wrong.
Empire Strikes Back is trying to be produced. You've got George in the US trying to build Skywalker Ranch, and like you said, rehome ILM, from Van Nuys down to the Bay Area. It makes sense for him to have had less of an eye on the production, I suppose, to begin with anyway. I mean, what I really like about the book is that actually where you can, you put the costings for stuff like how much Leah Brackett gets paid and how much, this costs and stuff. And I think for a lot of people, they just don't kind of understand actually how much films cost and why they cost so much. So in a really natural way, you've kind of covered that, which is kind of really interesting just to do. So it's just a really nice kind of point, I think. And it helps with the story, I think, for the over budget aspect of the book.
Well, I'm glad that you think so. And I tried to be judicious where I put in costs, because there's a lot of cost information coming, but sometimes it seemed interesting and to the point, so I put it in. And sometimes I compare it to other things to get some kind of idea of how much that meant. It was a huge amount of money. And George was already pouring money. It was more when Empire came out that he really started spending a lot of money on Skywalker. But Skywalker was already starting, and he was running a company, and he was doing a lot of other things, and he was, doing the Raiders stuff. And this time he starts having a lot of different projects, whereas when he was doing Star Wars, he'd really had just Star Wars to work on. And I remember him saying one time, and this was much later, this is during episode 3, because by then he even had even more projects going on. And he said, back when I was working on Star Wars and Empire, he said, I knew every frame of those movies. I was so focused. I knew everything that was going on. So there was some of that going on, but he was still more focused on Empire than Star Wars. And then I think starting with Return of the Jedi, his focus became less. But still, I think it's one of the things why he was annoyed on Empire was that he had to go over there and basically be there for the last few weeks as they were filming and sort of sitting there with Kirshner and kind of doing he basically was doing the producer's job at that point. He didn't want to be doing that. It was always a bit of a tug of war with George, was how much time he wants to spend on a project and how much time he has to spend on a project.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
George has always said that he wanted to be that independent filmmaker, make the films that he wanted to make, and didn't really want to be the big studio guy. And then, of course, Star Wars is the monster hit. Lucasfilm takes off, ILM takes off, the ranch gets built, all these, and then he becomes the head guy at a massive company. Do you think there was ever any sense of regret of that, or was it an organic thing that just happened, and he almost stepped back years later and realised that it had gone not quite the way he thought it might go?
Only George could really answer that question from the outside, and I wasn't there in the early years. As you know, I spoke with Marsha Lucas the other day. Well, it's probably about a year ago now, but and got her perspective, which was really interesting. I think they did. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to build Skywalker Ranch. It was something that he'd wanted to do since his days with Coppola. He wanted to build this campus for filmmaking, so it was this big opportunity that almost nobody ever has. He had the money to do it. So, and he's kind of like Walt Disney in that he wanted to build too. He loves building. And I saw that firsthand. He never, ever stops building. There's always several building projects going on somewhere in his little, or I should say, it's not a vast empire, but it's a mini empire, whatever you want to call it. And so I don't think it was happening to him, but sometimes I think he felt like it was definitely more than he wanted to deal with. And in the book that was canceled, the Force Awakens book, I started by plotting out as best I could all the different times George had announced his retirement. I can't remember. There's at least 5 or 6 official times that he said he was retiring before he actually did. And there's probably more.
Do you think then that's why he's so invested now in the Lucasfilm, rather the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, that it's another bit? He seems to like buildings. It seems to be a thing. I know he's into architecture. Do you think that's probably why he's put his energies into that for the time being?
Well, it's certainly a big aspect of that which he loves, which is to build these beautiful buildings, without a doubt. I mean, yeah. Have you guys been to Skywalker Ranch?
I went about 7 years ago. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've seen it. I mean, it's a unbelievable, utopian-like creation that he's built, and it's. I hope that it's preserved. That he puts the money aside to preserve it, and Big Rock Ranch, and even Presidio is not as nice, but it's still a fantastic campus.
Yeah,
and then the museum is, of course, is that plus his art collection, and I've seen a bit of it, and he's a real patron of the arts. I mean, he's the real deal. He cares deeply about it. So I think he gets a big kick out of that. I think it's very important to him.
And of the projects that he's made film-wise, given that he's into art, as you say, we would consider Star Wars probably more pop art than art in the sense that we're talking. How do you think George views it? How do you think he views his own work?
Well, there's different layers of the artwork that goes into a movie. There's, the concept art, and whether that's art with a capital A or more like, sort of the drawing section of a museum, which is sort of art with maybe not, it's a small A, but still art. Only time will decide that. Personally, I think Ralph McQuarrie's paintings are as good as a lot of paintings that are in museums.
Yeah,
and which are certainly be in museums. And the same with a lot of the drawings too, are as good as a lot of drawings that you see that are considered to be high art. and then film themselves. I would argue that they're certainly the films that succeed are as great as any great work of art. And there's some things that are in a league by itself, like the pyramids of Giza. That's something else. But in terms of like Renaissance painting, maybe not Michelangelo and Da Vinci, but maybe the next tier down.
Yeah.
The great movies are in that category for me. But people can categorize it as they want. But I don't know. I think George, I don't know for sure what he thinks, but I think he takes it pretty seriously. Doesn't take Indiana Jones as seriously as Star Wars, in terms of the meaning of the films.
Sure.
Because there's two different layers. There's like meaning, and then there's sort of the actual kinetic experience of watching a movie. And you can argue that it doesn't really make much of a difference. That Indiana Jones has as much meaning as Star Wars, because just as film, it works just as well.
Yeah.
But if you try and get a meaning out of Indiana Jones, you're probably reading stuff into it, which is fine. Whereas Star Wars had stuff built into it, and which George said is more like an onion, and you can peel back the different layers, and you get more and more things out of it, which were put in intentionally. But whether he would admit to that, because if anybody says I'm doing high art, they're immediately going to be laughed out of the room. So nobody wants to say that. I think one of George's friends, the guy, John Milius, he said, we're just entertainers. And there's an argument for that too. But some entertainment transcends time and others falls, to the wayside. So that remains to be seen.
Yeah, it's a cultural impact, I think, which sometimes helps define what something is, isn't it? And obviously Star Wars and the original trilogies had a huge cultural impact, both from the fans and the film industry as well.
Right. Well, it's funny because there's definitely the cultural impact means that in a written history, they're going to pay some attention to you, maybe, because there are plenty of silent film stars that we've already completely forgotten about that were humongous in their day. I mean, they were just the most famous things on the planet. But pretty much, I'm trying to think of one, like Mary Pickford as an actor. Well, let me think of more of a creator. I can't think of anybody offhand, but there were some directors who were very big from the early stage, and they're already completely forgotten. Whereas Charlie Chaplin, we're still talking about. And why is that? You'd have to go back and compare. There's something different going on. And so, you might, and already you have movies that win Oscars, like The Artist, and nobody can even remember that movie. And it won the Oscar.
Yeah.
Right, for Best Picture.
And here we are.
150 years, who knows if they'll be talking about Star Wars or not in any level.
Hi, I'm Toby Jetson, and you're listening to Panther Tracks.
You mentioned that you'd started working on the making of Force Awakens. Is there a regret that you never got the chance to finish that project?
No, because I finished the writing part, and as I've said, and I'm just being honest. I knew the book would not be published. I'd already experienced 2 or 3 years of working at Disney. There was a certain level, in my opinion, of confusion as to what was wanted and not wanted. And I just thought, this isn't going to work. I'm going to do it. I'm just putting, I knew I didn't put in anything that was in any way controversial. I just recorded what had happened and what people said. But I knew that was not something that the powers that be were going to want spelled out. Just didn't, because when you spell it all out, it was a troubled production. And as I've said before, what production isn't troubled at some level. Sure. George didn't hide any of that stuff, but I just thought that Disney was not going to be too thrilled about it, and I wasn't surprised at all, and didn't care at all that it was canceled.
Was it very much in the same vein as the other 3 books? It was similar style and similar presentation?
Yeah, pretty similar. I mean, it wasn't laid out. There was an earlier version that had been laid out, but it would have been the same physical format. That was the plan. And it was the same basic thing, talking about pre-production, production, and then post. And I went ahead and interviewed, the actors and a couple of people at Disney, and I had interviewed a lot of people going into it before I'd done the work. So as an historical document, it would be nice if it were published someday.
Yeah.
But I just wouldn't hold my breath.
Did it cover just the production of Force Awakens, or was it also about when Disney acquired Lucasfilm? Did it cover that era as well? Or
Yeah, the idea was, the reason why they brought me on was to sort of do a little bit more of that. And so, yeah, I covered, not in great detail, but the major points, and what some of the newspapers were saying, and how people felt. The whole sort of new era, shall we say, starting the whole new, the new era that was beginning.
It's a fascinating period of time as a Star Wars fan as well, because obviously the company goes from being that independent little scrappy company that did, and then becomes part of a massive whole. It did very much change the landscape, didn't it? Yeah,
I think George, clearly from his statements in the press, has ambivalent feelings about from before he did it to while he was doing it to after he did it. But I think he must have wanted his characters to live on, and Disney was the company that was in the best position to do that, given its giant size. And in Disney's credit, I mean, they're doing a lot of things that make a lot of people happy.
Yeah.
The parks are fantastic. I can't wait to bring my grandson one day to one of the parks. And they employ something like 150,000 people.
Yeah,
they're getting their livelihood. So if they're not perfect, it's not the end of the world.
Your star as a writer had descended to the point that when you did move on, you did Making a Planet of the Apes, Making of Alien. Those books have gone down really well. How interesting was it to dive into different franchises, different productions, and do presumably a similar sort of level of research for those books as well?
It was great. It was really great. I was so excited. I pitched Planet of the Apes to Fox because my old boss from Lucasfilm, Carol Roeder, was there, and she'd asked, and I said, "How about Planet of the Apes?" And they said yes, and I was just. But as opposed, the Star Wars books I'd have maybe in a leisurely year to do it. The Planet of the Apes, the Alien books, it's like 3 months, and they're done.
Wow.
So it's really hard. You're doing everything at once. You're interviewing, you're writing. That is a part where it's like, I just found this thing. I got to wrench this part apart and shoehorn it in there. It's much harder. But it was great doing something that wasn't Star Wars. And so Alien was great. And then doing the Rick Baker book. I don't know if you guys saw that one with Rick Baker.
Yeah.
That was great, getting to know Rick and learning about dimensional makeup, which I knew nothing about. And he was a great patient teacher, and of course he was there to correct all the mistakes. So it's been really great going freelance, and then finally having the time to finish my own book, the historical fiction thriller called All Up.
All Up, yeah.
We were going to come to that, yeah.
Seems like a convenient time.
Yeah, what a segue.
Yeah, good segue. Tell us a bit about that then. It's a change of tack for you. What precipitated wanting to dive into doing this?
Well, I'd been interested in doing it for a while, and I'd started doing the research, and so then I finally had the time to really dive into it and tell this story, which we all know bits and pieces of, but hardly any of us know the complete story. And I wanted to tell the story of the first space age, basically starting just before World War II. About half the book takes place during World War II, and the other half is the space race that people know more about. But people don't generally know all the stuff that went into it, all of the politics, all of the, a lot of killing. Rockets in the beginning were basically... the main goal of the rocket was to kill as many people as possible in your country.
B2s and stuff.
Yeah. I'm sure you guys know people who have very distinct memories of the V2s and the V1 rockets falling on London. And thereabouts. It must have been truly terrifying. So as I got into the story, it's just like the other things I mentioned. I don't go into it as an expert. I go into it in order to learn things myself.
Yeah.
And so I read, probably over 100 books, as I was sort of preparing sort of the research chronology version. And I also wanted to get into things that you can't really do in a nonfiction. I didn't want to do a nonfiction because I knew if I wanted to include, there were people who placed Von Braun at Roswell, and there's Philip Corso's book about reverse engineering things that they found from crashed UFOs.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff is too controversial. It's so hard. You spend the entire book justifying why this is in your book. But if it's a novel, you can just do it.
Yeah.
You're not saying it definitely happened. It's a novel. So, it might have happened, maybe it didn't, but you can certainly put in a novel and nobody's going to care because you're not saying it really happened. So I tried to tell, though, as truthful a tale and as truthful a historical recreation as I could, bringing in some of these more esoteric traditions and or stories, including, the fact that many people in the space program were Freemasons, and what did that have to do with anything, if anything?
Yeah.
And getting into people's heads and what was von Braun like, maybe, and what was his Soviet counterpart, Korolev, like, most people have never heard of Korolev, but because his identity was a secret. But he was, of course, arguably the most important person in the whole story, because he's the one who launched Sputnik and the first man in space and the first woman in space and all that stuff. And there were just so many great stories that I read about. I thought this will make a great novel and hopefully one day a great TV show.
I was going to say that it has a very, very filmic feel about it. It was that kind of part of the DNA when you were stitching it together.
Absolutely. I mean, also, I used to be a painter. I love Star Wars because it's visual. Everything in the book has a visual component to it because for me, that's just the fun way of doing it. And I hope readers can see it in their minds as they're reading it and feel that sort of visual excitement as they're, these big battles and there's launching of rockets and, the RAF launched this humongous bombing mission to try and bomb the secret German rocket base out of existence, which most people don't know about. It's one of the biggest bombing missions the English launched during the war. They had to do it by a full moon and they had to fly really low, and they had a feint mission of mosquitoes leading the German fighters off to Berlin, but then the German fighters over Berlin realized there was nobody there, and they could see in the north of Germany this big battle going on with huge explosions. And they basically, because they were at a more elevated altitude, they basically dive bombed from Berlin straight to Peenemünde.
Wow. And
the last English bombers were, caught and had terrific casualties. And it's just the drama that went into this was just amazing. And so I found it, just a very, very gripping story, which I think people really will enjoy reading about.
That feels like the sort of thing that George would have used as inspiration for Star Wars.
Well, we all know that he used those World War II movies as inspiration, particularly the Dam Busters and other things. No question about it. Yeah, he was brilliant at combining all those things that went into making something new out of them in Star Wars.
As we wrap this up, Empire, obviously, 40 years old now. Most people, certainly people in the fandom, have very fond memories of it. What would your takeaway be from looking back at Empire? Also, as somebody that's dived into the details of it as well for the book.
My takeaway for Empire is similar to the takeaway for any film. I just am in so much awe and admiration of all the different talents and crafts and genial people who collaborate together to make this, what I would say is a work of art. In this case, that rises to the level of work of art. And the millions of people then get to enjoy over now. It's been 40 years, and I think it's definitely going to last at least another 30 years, if not much longer, because people are showing it to their children, and it's such brilliant storytelling, right? But over it all, you have this very fantastic storyteller who is George Lucas, working with then a lot of really great artists. And I always forget somebody, but basically you've got John Williams, whose music is genius. Yeah. Ben Burt, who's a genius sound designer. Ralph McQuarrie, a genius artist. Joe Johnston, a genius artist. Yeah. And the list goes on plus some very talented actors, who, I don't think I'm qualified to say who's a genius actor or not, but certainly some very fine actors. And I think Mark Hamill deserves all the credit that he gets and more. And so it's just a fantastic moment in our time. And I think we're lucky that we get to appreciate it. We get to experience it. And I hope that too, that it's always shown in movie theaters. I think they should drag out 70 millimeter prints and restore them and show them in the the biggest movie houses in the world.
Thank you so much for giving us your time today. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll speak again on another book someday.
Yeah, hopefully. That would be nice.
The sequel.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this special episode of Making Tracks. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit panthertracks.com or check out the free Panther Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@panthertracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Panthertracks, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Panthertracks intro, Adam O'Brien for our Making Tracks opening music, and Mike Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Jonathan.
Coming up next on Panther Tracks Radio, it's Desert Planet Discs.
Thanks for having me.